Good day. Those of you who have been following my channel since its inception will know that one of the very first programs I made, which have appeared on this channel, was one in which I discussed the possibility, or rather the prospect, of a digital ruble being introduced next year by the Russian Central Bank. I said in that video that this could be a game-changing event which would allow the Russians to circumvent the SWIFT system of interbank payment transfers, thereby, in effect, depriving the United States of its most powerful sanctions weapon. Well, as events have turned out, we don't have to wait next year because another country, China, has acted first and has been the first major economy to introduce a digital version of its currency, the RMB, or Yuan as it's also known. This has provoked some concern in Washington, and there has been a detailed article discussing this topic in the Wall Street Journal, which makes many of the same points that I made when I discussed the prospective digital ruble, which is indeed coming next year, in that program I did for my channel some weeks ago. Briefly, a digital currency doesn't have to use banks, can be transmitted from one person directly to another through the necessary technology, by use of the necessary technology, and it doesn't rely, therefore, on the interbank payment system, SWIFT, which is ultimately dominated by Western countries and by the United States. Also, of course, by definition, it circumvents the dollar. Most international currency transactions and most payments of goods that are internationally traded take place in dollars. If digital currencies begin to establish themselves, as is looking increasingly likely, the role of the dollar will become redundant. It seems that in the case of the Chinese digital RMB or Yuan, all you need, in effect, is an app on a phone. You don't even need an internet connection. You can transfer money via the app from one phone to the other. All you need are the telephone numbers and electricity to keep the phone charged. It is something that has massive implications for the future of the world financial system. And the United States, unsurprisingly, as the Wall Street Journal says, is becoming increasingly concerned about this. There's apparently now talk, in fact there's more than talk, there's a plan to create a digital version of the dollar, though quite how that will address the problem that national digital currencies such as the digital RMB and the digital ruble will pose, I'm not frankly sure. The United States seems to think that if it can get a digital dollar up and running, people will prefer to use it than the other digital national currencies that are now appearing. Well, perhaps in the United States and in Western Europe they will. But it's not obvious to me why this should be so internationally. After all, one of the things that made the dollar dominant as the world's reserve currency in the period just before and after the Second World War was that the United States was in those days the world's biggest economy. It was the biggest producer of goods, of hard goods, and the biggest trader of hard goods. It was also the biggest market and therefore the biggest consumer of such goods. Well, this isn't going to be the case for very much longer. China's economy, in terms of purchasing power parity, is now actually bigger than that of the US, and it will probably overtake the United States in nominal terms shortly, at least by the end of this decade. And of course, China indisputably today has a significant bigger manufacturing capacity, in fact, a very much bigger manufacturing capacity than the United States does, and is now the world's biggest exporter of hard and durable goods. It's also becoming an increasingly important market and an importer of goods from all sorts of countries. So I can very well see why a Chinese digital currency might be more attractive to many people than a US dollar, a digital dollar would be. They can buy their goods from China, sell their goods to China, trade through the digital currency, circumventing the dollar entirely. It will be straightforward and easy to do. It would not require banks, it would not require the SWIFT system, and it could be done very fast, almost instantaneously, and it could all be done through a mobile phone and an app on that phone, with China, of course, busy producing the phones which would be distributed to more and more countries. Russia maybe is obviously a much smaller economy, but it's also becoming, and this is a fact which people perhaps don't realize, an important trading economy also. It is, after all, one of the world's biggest exporters of oil, of food, of grain, of all kinds of products, the same kind of products, by the way, which were the United States' primary exports as the US economy began to take off at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th. Again, I could see why, if you are an oil importer, say in Germany, wanting to import your oil from Russia, or you want to import natural gas from Russia, you might decide that it might be easier and simpler for you to do it in Russian digital currencies as opposed to American dollars. Perhaps that won't happen instantly, but I can see how it could happen fairly quickly. I'm sure it will happen fairly quickly in certain other countries that Russia trades with, for example, the Central Asian states, and possibly also Iran. Now, I mention Iran because, interestingly enough, no less a person than Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who has just been on a massive journey to India, Pakistan, the Gulf states, Egypt, has now arrived in Iran, and he has given an interview to the Iranian media in which he has made a number of points, and specifically has talked about sanctions and the importance of bypassing sanctions. And these were his words. As for the sanctions policy pursued by Washington, our stance remains unchanged. We will continue to reject any unilateral restrictions which, on top of everything else, affect the most disadvantaged groups of population. Russia has been vocal about the inadmissibility of such restrictions at various international platforms, including the United Nations. I am pleased to note that our position is widely supported by members of the world community. And here comes the crunch. It is equally important to step up efforts to reduce risks associated with sanctions and potential expenses for economic operators. In particular, gradual steps should be taken to move towards de-dollarization of national economies and transition to payments in national or alternative currencies, as well as to stop using international payment systems controlled by the West. Russia has been working actively to that end. We see great prospects for cooperation in that field with all interested international partners. Well, it's not difficult to understand what Lavrov is talking about. He's clearly referring partly to Russia's new interbank payment system, created as an alternative to SWIFT, which is apparently exists but has not been activated and won't be activated unless Russia is disconnected from SWIFT, but also to the new digital currencies that are now appearing. And in fact, he specifically refers to payments in national or alternative currencies and speaks about the importance of stopping the use of international payment systems controlled by the West. So, this is the plan, and it's one which I am sure all of these countries, China, Russia, undoubtedly and indisputably Iran, which by the way does now have its own interbank payment system, alternative to SWIFT, since it has been disconnected from SWIFT, all of these countries will be using these digital currencies to trade with each other and for their business people to trade with each other very long. It is important to say that by bypassing the dollar, the United States no longer has the means to track and monitor these transactions. If payments are made through digital RMB or digital rubles, the United States cannot in effect block them by imposing sanctions on their users. It cannot stop these transfers by unplugging banks that participate in them through SWIFT, and indeed many of these transfers don't need banks to happen at all, since they can be done directly through phones and apps which these countries are fully capable of producing. The countries themselves that use these digital currencies will, of course, be able to keep a watch on these transactions, but the United States will not be. Apparently, there's been a study in the United States which has found that if North Korea, for example, wants to import technology for its nuclear program using digital RMB, Chinese currency, it could do so and circumvent US sanctions. This is the consequence of the grotesque overuse of the sanctions weapon in which the United States has engaged and the attendant abuse of the reserve position of the dollar. No doubt, digital currencies in some form would have come anyway, but if the international business community and all the states around the world still had confidence and trust in the dollar and accepted that the United States would use the dollar in a responsible way, treating its reserve status as a trust imposed upon the United States, as opposed to a weapon that the United States could use to conduct economic war upon other countries, then it's unlikely that these digital currencies would be posing the challenge to the dollar's reserve status that they clearly do. The fact that they do, after all, has just been confirmed by none other than Sergei Lavrov in that interview he gave to the Iranian media. So this is where we see the classic example of how abuse of a tool, the sanctions weapon, can result in negative consequences for the abuser. Now, what will happen if the dollar does indeed lose its reserve status? What happens, for example, if Saudi Arabia, which increasingly sells its oil to China, decides that in future it will accept payment for that oil from Chinese importers in Chinese digital RMB, and if German businesses start buying natural gas and oil and other products from Russia and start paying for them in digital rubles. All possible, not perhaps likely to happen immediately, but most likely to happen to an increasing degree over the next few years. Will this mean the collapse of the United States? Well, obviously not. The United States remains a mighty and big economy. It will withstand even the loss of the dollar's reserve status. However, that doesn't mean that won't have an impact on events in the United States itself. The United States, as I've talked about this in other programs, has been spending massively on all sorts of things. Joe Biden has announced a massive relief package, which amounts to $2 trillion. There's on top of that a $4 trillion infrastructure package. Some people say that it will amount to $10 trillion. There's been an increase in US defense spending. The US defense budget next year is going to be increased by $750 billion, apparently. The United States has apparently spent something like $10 trillion over the last year or so, and the US budget deficit is skyrocketing. The US has been able to do this to the extent that it has because the dollar has reserve status. It means that the United States doesn't have to worry too much about overspending in this fashion, because even if inflation does increase, as I expect, that increase will be capped because the reserve currency status of the dollar means that people and countries and businesses around the world have to hold on to dollars in order to engage in commercial and business and economic activity, and that automatically gives the dollar value and means that the risk of hyperinflation, which some people talk about, is greatly mitigated. However, if the dollar no longer has reserve status, then the United States cannot print money in the way that it does. It cannot cover its deficits to the extent that it does. It cannot engage in vast overspending in the way that it does. It can't perhaps even finance its defense budget to the extent that it does. Or at least it can possibly do some of these things, but only by taxing itself far more heavily than it does presently. Now, in saying this, I should make it clear that unlike many people in Europe, I am well aware of the fact that taxes in the United States are nowhere near as low as many Europeans imagine them to be. So the tax burden that the US would be facing if the United States were to lose if the dollar were to lose the position of the world's reserve currency, would be extremely affected. Either the United States would have to learn to cut back on many of its spending programs because it would not be able to run budget and trade deficits to the extent that it does, or it would have to tax its population far more steeply in order to maintain its spending commitments, with all the consequences that would have for the dynamism and vitality of its economy. The United States would in effect cease to be the exceptional country that some people talk about, and would have to operate its economy like everyone else. Well, is that something that the United States is prepared for? Are policymakers in Washington adjusting to this possibility? Doesn't seem likely to me. Well, maybe my expectations of the importance of digital currencies are overstated. Maybe it will turn out that despite their probable introduction, things will remain much as they are, and that the dollar will continue to be the most widely traded currency, including as a digital currency, and perhaps interest in the digital RMB and to a lesser extent the digital ruble and any other digital currencies which appear will be less than I expect. I don't think so. And perhaps the first tremors of worry are starting to appear in Washington, though up to now there doesn't seem to be anything that remotely resembles a plan. Thank you for joining me for this program on this channel. Please look up my other channel, the channel where I do my programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, our main channel, the Duran. Please also check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please check out also our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble and Odyssey. You'll find all our videos there. Please also support us to the extent that you can through PayPal, Patreon, and a subscribe star. And I should say that we do accept payments in alternative currencies, though these, of course, do not yet extend to digital national currencies, which have only are only being introduced very gradually as I speak. Please also look up our Discord server and don't forget to check out our shop and see the wonderful things we have there. Our magic mugs, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hats and our hoodies. And I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and have a wonderful day.